Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another power session, another VMware Code power session. We have Jatin over from Bangalore, and then we also have Angel over from Bulgaria. Yeah, so and we're going to be talking about the latest enhancements with the vSphere APIs and SDKs. I'll go ahead. I'm looking over for the blog post, and I'll put it here in the chat. But yeah, everybody feel free to ask questions, post your questions. Yeah, so this is being streamed on YouTube, LinkedIn. You can catch us over on Slack or Discord or Twitter. Yeah, and we'll make sure to catch your questions and ask the team. All right, without further ado, Jatin, let me turn it over to you. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Perfect. Thanks, Frankie, for giving this opportunity. I think it's very exciting for us to present some of the enhancement that we are doing with API, SDK, and also with the CLI space. But before we begin with, my name is Jatin Purohit. I work with VMware Cloud Foundation Division at Broadcom. I mainly look after tech marketing, covering the hyperscaler, specifically Oracle Cloud VMware solution, and also the API, SDK, and CLI space. I have around 10 years of experience, started with system administrator, then moved into engineering, and now into the technical marketing. Over these years, I was basically looking into core vSphere stack, and now also looking at the VCF stack. So that's about me, and we'll hear more on the API, SDK, CLI as we move ahead. Now over to you, Angel, if you can quickly introduce yourself, and then we can get started.
Yeah, thanks, Frankie and Jatin, for organizing this session. I'm Angel, and I'm from VCF team. I'm product manager. I joined VMware before 2 years and a half, and my mission is really to improve about the whole automation story of vSphere back in the days, and now the VCF automation story that includes all the APIs, SDKs, and CLI, like Jatin said. In the next hour or so, we are going to provide you more updates on this topic, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Perfect. So let me set some context before we actually dive into the presentation and also the demo. So this session is mainly focused on the developer community. We have two personas when we talk about automation tools. The first persona is basically the administrator who are doing the system administration task, who are building, monitoring, and then administrating the entire VMware stack. And then we have the developer community, which basically builds their own solution on top of VMware stack. It can be a backup solution, it can be a DR solution, it can be a security solution, or it can be a managed cloud service solution. When we think of both of these personas, the kind of tooling, the kind of technologies that they interact when they automate their VMware infrastructure is quite different. So let's first address the first persona, which I believe most of you belongs to, and that is the system administrators. For all these years, we had an excellent tool, which is Power CLI. All our system administrators, all our customers love it. And the fact that how popular this tool is, if you actually go and check the number of downloads for Power CLI, it's more than 25 million over the years, right? So that's the scale Power CLI has been adopted. Then we also have Terraform. Since the inception of public cloud, right, Terraform has become kind of a de facto tool for infrastructure as a code. If you want to do an infrastructure versioning, if you want to do like drift configuration, drift management, the Terraform is the tool for you. And we have made a huge stride in that space as well. And then I think Angel can give me the numbers, but the number of downloads over Terraform provider is also over the million, and probably more than 2 million. So these are like, Ansible, Terraform, Power CLI are the tools that most of our administrators use. And why they love it? They love it because the first aspect why all these system administrators are loving these tools is because these tools are essentially abstracting all the complexities, all the challenges that you may experience while directly working with APIs or SDK are gone. For example, if you write a sample code in Power CLI, you are not bothering about what kind of APIs you are actually invoking behind the scene. So that's the level of abstraction I'm talking about. But then let's come on the second persona, which is the developer persona. This persona is basically belongs to all our partners who are building the integrated solutions on top of VMware stack. As I've said, it can be backup DR or or security or any space in that aspect. Um, these persona or these user actually consume most of our APIs and SDK. They basically get access to VMware APIs. They have SDKs, which are basically the client libraries to execute these APIs, and then they build their own web services on top of it. I think most of the work that we are doing at VMware, and Angle is basically leading that particular work on the product management side, is to basically ensure that how can we deliver a simple, extensible, and a manageable automation experience across our API, SDK, and CLI. And that's what we will be discussing in this particular session. I will take a pause, and if there are any questions, I will take a couple of questions. And Angel, if you have any thought, please bring them on.
Yeah. I just want to summarize that actually what we are working is providing a solution for a private cloud to give you the same capability and agility like the public cloud provides with their automation solution, with their APIs and SDKs. This is what we are looking for. How the VMware, or let's call it VCF, automation stack to be more agile, more simplified, like the public hyperscalers did it already.
Perfect. So let me switch over to a quick presentation. I don't have much slides, and then we can quickly actually go into some of the demos. But let me quickly get started with a couple of slides to get the level set. So let's say if you are an administrator or if you are the one who doesn't really know what is API and SDK, this is just a quick context to level set that expectation. So essentially, assuming that you are a backup vendor who is creating a web service to do some backup jobs on VMware virtual machines, essentially what you will be doing is you will be building a web service which can schedule a backup, which can restore a backup, which can do an offline migration, and there may be some other task that you want to do. For that, you have to basically have a way to communicate with the VMware infrastructure. So if you're building a backup solution, you might need access to, let's say, a VMware virtual machine service to basically get the virtual machine, to create the virtual machine, or maybe to edit or modify your virtual machine configuration. Again, I'm just explaining at a very high level. It doesn't mean that all these tasks you will be doing when you actually build a web service. You might have access to vSAN service, VMFS, for managing the storage endpoints. And then you might also want to have an access to our data protection APIs, which is VADP service. So the way we allow these interaction between these two web services, on the left hand side, you have your own web service, which is your backup service. On the right hand side, it is the provider service, which is the VMware service. To enable the communication between two different web services, uh, that kind of mechanism is what we call it as API, right? So it basically gives you a programmatical access to your web services and its resources. A typical API has an API client, which can be Postman, which can be CLI interface, which can be a web service, or it can be simply as simple as a web browser. So API client sends a request to an API server. In this particular case, the server can be VMware vCenter server, VMware vSAN endpoint, or VMware ESXi. And then the server throws a response based on the request that API client has basically produced. So that's basically a client server architecture, and that's how request and response mechanism works. And this is a very basic building block of any API that you want to understand. So in simple, it is basically an application programming interface. The whole intention for API is to establish a communication between two different web services, or between API client and API server. And then the another goal for API is to basically provide the level of abstraction. What do I mean by level of abstraction? Let's take a look at the virtual machine. The virtual machine is basically considered an object. If you think from a programmatical view, it's an object. This object has certain properties which basically defines the characteristic of this object. So for example, what is the name, what is the operating system, what is the network, what is the storage layout, and things of those lines. So these are the properties that define that virtual machine. And then comes the method. Methods are the actions that you invoke on that particular virtual machine. Action can be power on, start, stop virtual machine. Now, if you look at an object which is built into VMware, it has maybe thousands of properties and hundreds of methods, or a number can be here and there. We from our side, we don't want to expose all these properties and methods. Could be for a security purpose, could be for a simplicity purpose. And rather, what we do is we build a level of abstraction when we expose these APIs, so that when you hit these APIs, you get a very specific set of output or a specific set of actions on those particular APIs. So that is the level of abstraction, which is basically aimed to simplify your experience with the API, and also giving you the ability to execute all the API operations in a lightweight, low latency environment. So that's the level of abstraction we mean. Then comes the standardization. Most of you are aware of REST API. This is a common API which everybody is using nowadays. And then you also have the SOAP API. The SOAP APIs are like all-time greats if I have to characterize it. So this is like probably 30 years, 40 years back, built by Microsoft. And then now we have the new APIs, which are GraphQL, Webhook, and Google RPC. In this particular session, we will focus more on the REST API and SOAP. And because that's where some of the enhancement that we have done, we don't deliver any of our API in GraphQL, Webhook, or gRPC. So let's first talk about the REST. The whole intention for REST is to basically work with a web protocol, which is the HTTP. And then it uses a very lightweight data format for sending a request and then receiving a response. So for example, what you see over here is basically a Postman interface. You have a method. Let me quickly highlight. You have a method. This is your API URL, which is the API server. This is the resource. This is the object on which you are executing the resource. And then this is the action. So in this particular API, if you see, it's under vCenter. We are dealing with the virtual machine object. There is a specific virtual machine, and then we are starting this virtual machine. Basically, we are powering on the virtual machine.
Yep.
And then, yep.
I'm sorry. Would you be able to share just the presentation instead of the whole screen? It looks a little small. I keep trying different things, but I
think the challenge is I'm using a wider monitor.
No, the good stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, this is the only slide which has a small fonts. Otherwise,
okay.
The slides are good.
No worries.
Okay.
Sorry. Apologies. Thank you.
Thanks, Frankie. Thanks for the reminder. And then the data format that you see over here is basically a JSON object. So we are basically passing the parameters to this particular API, and then it will throw a response, and you can see the response again in the JSON. So that's the REST API for you. Okay, now let's move and see the SOAP API. The SOAP API has a URL, and then all the resource and the operation is actually, you can say, sent as an XML message. So the way it happens is it has a SOAP envelope, which is this particular envelope. You have a body which basically contains the message. Now, if you see the difference between SOAP and REST, you will find that the message body contains the resource as well as it contains the operation. So power on VM is the operation, and this is actually the resource that you have. Now, if you compare both of these APIs, it is clear that SOAP APIs are a little bit complex to work with, because irrespective of what the API looks like, your API URL will remain same. It will remain same. You have the API server, and then it will just point to an instance where it has to execute. The rest of the thing, which is like request, resource, everything gets encoded into a message body, and then you execute this, send an XML data to a request, and then it will throw you an XML data as the output. So that's the SOAP API to understand. It works with HTTP, and it also works with other protocols such as SMTP, FTP, and so on. And then SOAP API strictly works on the XML data format, and it is very important to understand for the data context in this particular slide. Okay, so again, if you look at the structure, the API structure, you have different methods. You have get, you have post, you have put, you have delete. All of these methods are basically the HTTP methods, and then you have different data with which you work with. So in this particular case, we will be working with the JSON data. And then you have the resource URI, which is basically the server endpoint where the API will hit, and then this is the application with which you are accessing the API through. Again, if you look at the SOAP, you have the definition, which is basically WSDL. It is a strict XML document that you have to follow. So it doesn't matter what API you are sending, you have to follow this particular structure, which has SOAP envelope, SOAP body, and then you basically encapsulate your message as well as your resource and operation into it. So this is a very high level understanding of what is API and what kind of APIs that we have. It is very important for us to understand this particular differentiation between SOAP and REST to understand some of the stuff that we are releasing with the with vSphere 8 update 3. Okay, so let's move next. Now let's look at our current API state across the VCF stack. So what we have is on the vSphere side, we have SOAP and we have what is API specification, what does it mean? But for a starter, let's understand we have SOAP API, and the API specification for SOAP API is basically the WSDL, which is Web Service Definition Language. The API specification document that we are talking about, which is WSDL, it is basically an XML document. We also have REST API, which is basically the lightweight HTTP, the web-built APIs, and these are more modern and more lightweight when you execute the REST APIs. So for vSphere, we have SOAP, and we also have the REST API. We have introduced a new API, which is VI-JSON, and we will talk about that API later on. But the API specification that we have currently on vSphere is basically WSDL and OpenAPI v3. So WSDL is for SOAP, and OpenAPI v3 is for the VI-JSON. We are actually working on building the OpenAPI v3 specification for REST API as well. Now, if we talk about the vSAN, vSAN only has the SOAP API. And then the API specification that we have on vSAN is the WSDL. And that's a problem for us. I will explain you why it is a problem and what are we doing in this particular space. On the NSX, it is REST API. The current API specification document is OpenAPI v3. On the SDDC manager, again, it is REST, and the API specification is OpenAPI v3. The only difference now we have is Verni, which is currently on OpenAPI v2. But what I have heard from Angle, the most of the work is done, and soon we will be releasing OpenAPI v3 for Verni as well. But if you look at this picture, the one thing which comes to our mind is we have inconsistent API schema across VCF stack. It's not that huge, but if you look at vSphere and vSAN, what you have is you have different API endpoints and you have different API specifications. So for example, vSAN doesn't even have a REST API. It only works with SOAP API and WSDL. Similarly, vSphere, the huge API footprint on vSphere was basically built on SOAP API, and that is basically to ensure the backward compatibility and then have a huge coverage on the vSphere. So we have SOAP API over there as well. But in the large part, if you see, if you are a developer, you are basically encountering with different APIs and different API specification and their protocol. So what we have is basically an inconsistent API schema across VCF stack. Again, it's a very legacy issue which we had, and that is no unified authentication across API endpoints. So to give you an example, assuming that I'm authenticating, let's say, with a vSphere API, I cannot reuse the same authentication with the vSAN API. It's not possible. So that's a challenge. For each and every solution across VCF, you have to authenticate separately, and that's kind of a challenge when you work with work with VCF stack and build a very integrated, cohesive solution on your own. So that's another challenge that we have. The another challenge is inconsistent API reference documentation. There are some inconsistency in terms of where these documents are, how we are delivering these documents, and also some of the content that we see in some of these documents. So, for example, some of the API documentation misses the example, or how these examples are presented is also something which is a challenge to us. So that's what Angle is currently working on. And he's basically defining what is the winning state, where we want to be, and what are the things that we are prioritizing on the API and SDK stuff. So let's talk about the API first. This is a big news. We are actually releasing a REST-like API experience for all the SOAP API. So all the complexities that you have with working with SOAP APIs are gone, and we are introducing something which is known as VI JSON. I will explain you what is VI JSON and how to work with VI JSON, but that's the news from our side, that we are delivering a REST-like API experience for all the SOAP APIs across VCF stack, and we are delivering VI JSON to solve this particular problem. The unified authentication. Most of the work on this particular front is also delivered. So now you can basically authenticate with vSphere, with vSAN, and also if you basically zoom into the vSphere also has different API endpoints. So you can basically authenticate once and then use that authentication across all the API endpoints that is available to you. So that is again a roadmap item that we have. Some of it is delivered, some of it is work in progress. We want to be very clear that introducing VI JSON doesn't mean that we are getting rid of any of our API endpoint. That's not we are doing it. What we are doing is we are just giving you another API endpoint to have a REST-like experience on the SOAP API. So we are not deprecating, we are not removing our SOAP API endpoints. And what it means is if you have an existing solutions which are built on SOAP APIs, it will continue to run, it will continue to support, and we are there to ensure the backward compatibility for all the APIs that we have on vSphere, vSAN, NSX, and across VCF stack. So backward compatibility is ensured. We should not be worried about any of our solutions which are delivered with SOAP and breaking up in the future. So that's not going to happen. Backward compatibility is there, and we will ensure that particular backward compatibility going on. On the SDK, this is again work in progress, not yet delivered, but some of it is already been delivered, and we can basically see these actions after 8 update 3. So we are actually visualizing a unified VCF SDK. I haven't talked about SDK much, but SDKs are basically the client-side libraries which gives you the access to all the APIs that we have. So currently, if you look at the picture, you have probably 3-4 SDKs for vSphere, number of SDKs for vSAN, number of SDK for NSX, number of SDKs for let's say vRealize suite, and so on. So what you have is you basically have a fleet of SDKs that you have to work with if you are building a solution on top of VCF. So what we are visualizing and what we are prioritizing is to have a unified SDK which provides all the functionality across all the VCF stack solutions such as vSphere, vSAN, NSX, vRealize, and then you install a single SDK to basically get access to all the solutions. Again, on the delivery aspect, for example, if you are working with Python, right? If you just hit a command pip install VCF SDK, it should install all the SDKs that are required for you to run VCF. So instead of managing the separate SDKs, we are actually working on delivering a unified VCF SDK in the future. So stay tuned and we will give you more detail on this particular front. From our side, it is very important that we deliver Python and Java binding, Java SDK binding. Why Python and Java only? Because when we look at our telemetry data, the most frequent languages that our code community uses Python and Java. So we are there to basically build the SDK bindings on Python and Java. And then once we have the OpenAPI v3 conformance across the board, customers can download the OpenAPI v3 specification, and they can build their own API bindings with their preferred programming language. So I will come and talk about OpenAPI v3 in the later section, but the bottom line is we will be delivering Python and Java SDK, and then you can take the OpenAPI specification and you can build your own client-side SDK bindings of your own choice. So that flexibility will be there with you. And obviously, like the issues that we had on the authentication when we talk about APIs, the same kind of issues we have with the SDKs as well. If you authenticate, let's say with vSphere, you will not be able to authenticate with the vSAN. So you cannot reuse that authentication session with vSAN. So these kind of interchangeable authentication issues are currently there, and we would like to simplify that with something like unified authentication. You authenticate once with any of the
Just a
SDK, and it should. Yeah. Yeah.
just
Go
a bit
ahead.
of remark here, something about Jatin for the SDK is that when you heard about the new VCF unified SDK, please do not consider it as a brand new bindings that you have to rework all your solutions and automation tools or whatever solutions you have already built. Our key focus here is the backward compatibility. What it means that once we deliver this Python SDK to consist of all the existing SDK, we are going to call them components, and we are going to build a new components for the VCF products which doesn't have Python or Java SDKs. So that's why this way we are going to keep the backward compatibility, and we are going to provide the consistency. By consistency, what I mean is that the delivery channels will be consistent across the whole VCF stack. We are going to produce these open GitHub repository spaces like Python for Python and Maven for Java, but meanwhile, we are going to deliver the whole VCF SDK stack through the developer portal, because we know that it's really, really important for our, I'll call it finance customers, to be able to download it from a secure location. Yeah, this is the remark that I want to mention, Jatin.
Yeah, thanks, Engel, for calling this out. On the tooling, we are keen on providing complete coverage in Power CLI. So Power CLI will remain our de facto CLI tool and automation tool. So that doesn't change. We will continue to provide the feature coverage on Power CLI. And the good news is, I think last week only we did release Power CLI 13.3. So go there, run update Power CLI, and run update module vmware.powercli, and you will have the latest and greatest from Power CLI module.
We know that we are going to produce this session today. That's why we released the Power CLI just before 2 weeks.
Correct. So yeah, and on the API bindings, right? As I've said, we have different APIs. In this particular release, most of our work that we have done on Power CLI is to basically improve our experience on some of the API client bindings that we have. For example, we have simplified our experience and deserialize mechanism on some of the invoke commands that work with the REST API. So yeah, I would recommend you to basically update the Power CLI module and check the release notes for more details on what we have released in Power CLI, and we'll take it up from there. And then we are also expanding on Terraform and Ansible coverage, because I see most of our developers are also, they love to work on Terraform and Ansible, because they also offer these tool also offer some of the great features at the different way of provisioning and managing the infrastructure. So we are committed to deliver that experience also. On the delivery, most of the tools, APIs, and SDKs that we have, they are capable of, they are available online, and you can basically, simply execute commands and download this through online repository. But then we also have some of the customers who have a compliance obligation to not to download any tool, API, or SDK set from online repository. So for them, they will be able to do an offline installation through a Broadcom repository. So when you log into Broadcom, developer.broadcom.com, you will be able to download the SDKs, the CLIs that we are delivering. So it's really great for all the customers who have a compliance and security requirements to do the offline installation only. And then We are keen and we are committed to publishing all our modules on PyP, which is a Python repository for Python SDKs. Maven is for Java, and then GitHub is for the sample codes and some of the documents that you want to experience. So we will be publishing most of our API, SDK, and CLI stuff on these platforms so that you can do the online installation. Let me take a pause. Frankie, is there any question or we can continue?
No, go ahead and continue. Yeah,
Okay.
nothing yet.
Okay.
Thank you.
So that's basically the roadmap item. Most of the things that you have seen in the last slide has already been delivered. So let's quickly see what have been delivered. We have delivered and introduced a new API via protocol. When I say via protocol, it means that it's the same API, it's the same resource endpoint. It's just the way you execute these APIs. So we are introducing a new via protocol, which is the VI JSON, and we will talk more about VI JSON in detail. So this is basically providing a REST-like experience for all our SOAP APIs. We have delivered unified API authentication, which means you authenticate once with any of our API endpoint, be it vSphere Web Service API or vSphere Automation API or vSAN APIs. You will be able to authenticate a bit between them. So you can basically reuse the session. SDK management, as I've said, we are keen to deliver a unified VCF SDK, but there are few steps that we needed to do in order to reach there. So the first thing that we have done is we have merged our vSAN Python SDK and pyvmomi. Pyvmomi is the SDK for vSphere Web Service API built into Python, and then we had a separate SDK called vSAN Python SDK. In past, a developer has to basically download and then configure both of these SDKs separately. But now the good news is both of these SDKs are merged, and once you do pip install pyvmomi, you get the vSphere web service management SDK, which is pyvmomi, and you also have a vSAN SDK packaged within pyvmomi. So that's the SDK management and delivery capabilities that we have released. In future, we will be merging the other SDKs as well, which are ranging from NSX, ARIA, or some other solutions that we have. And by merging and consolidating all these SDKs, we will be able to basically deliver a unified SDK. So, but as of now, we have merged Python and pyvmomi together. And then also we had recent releases for Power CLI and Terraform, so you can check out the release note and you can get more details about what we have delivered on Power CLI. But if we look at, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to add something for the SDK management. One really great enhancement in terms of user experience. We introduced a new functionality. We call it auto completion type hint functionality, and now it works across the VC, not only pyvmomi but also the vSAN. So, now writing code based on pyvmomi and vSAN is much more easier than before.
Yeah, and we have a demo for that as well. So we'll show you how that auto completion works for pyvmomi. Okay, let's move on, which is our marquee topic for this particular session, which is introducing VI JSON. Before I introduce VI JSON, let's quickly recap where exactly our vSphere automation story is there. So you have vCenter, you have vSphere Web Service API. This API has SOAP API endpoint, and now this is a new one, which is the VI JSON. These are the old APIs, which are basically created since I believe vCenter or whatever product name we had at 2.0. So these are basically very old APIs that you have been using for all these years. Then we have the new APIs, which are vSphere Automation API. These APIs are written in REST, and all the new features that you see, for example, Lifecycle Manager, Configuration Manager, all of these new features are basically incorporated into vSphere Automation API. For vSphere Web Service API, we have a management SDK, which we call it as vSphere Management SDK. It has Python and Java language binding. And on the REST API, we have Automation SDK, and this is again a separate. This also comes with two different language binding, Python and Java. And then on top of it, we have the tooling. So we have Power CLI, Terraform, DCLI, Ansible, everything that you as a system administrator is using comes over there. Now, what we have done with VI JSON is, if you look at this particular side, which is the left-hand side, you have the vSphere Web Service API, which is basically covering some of the important fundamental pieces in the VMware infrastructure. For example, managing the virtual machine, managing the sessions, managing the ESXi host, managing snapshots, right? All the core virtual infrastructure service that you are using are basically covered with vSphere Web Service API. Until 8 update 1, you only had the SOAP API endpoint, which means that if you want to use a vSphere Web Service API, the only wire protocol that was available was SOAP. Now, the request from our customer was, SOAP is old. We want a REST API coverage for vSphere Web Service APIs, because now you also have the vSphere Automation API, which are written in REST. These are lightweight, very easy to consume, and very easy to work with. But if I want to build a very comprehensive solution on top of vSphere or even VCF, what I have is I have set of APIs which are written in SOAP, and then set of APIs which are written in REST. So please give us a solution to bridge that particular gap. Transitioning directly from SOAP to REST will take a huge amount of effort from our side, because we are not just talking about here 5 APIs, 10 APIs. We are actually talking about hundreds of API. And already most of the existing solutions that we see in our ecosystem are built on SOAP. So there is no way we can do a quick transition from SOAP to REST. So that's something which we can't do it overnight. We found a middle ground, and we basically offered a new wire protocol, which is VI JSON. VI JSON basically works on JSON RPC, but it provides you a REST-like experience for the same SOAP API. So now what you have is, you have legacy APIs which were written in SOAP, but they have a new API endpoint, which is the VI JSON, and this API endpoint gives you a REST-like experience. So now what you have vSphere Web Service APIs, which you can use it with VI JSON and deliver a REST-like experience, and you have new APIs which are already written in the REST API. So that's the change, and that's the update that we have introduced with vSphere 8 update 1, and we introduced a VI JSON to provide a REST-like experience for our old legacy and important APIs, which is vSphere Web Service API. So how does this VI JSON looks like? You have the API client, you send a JSON RPC request, and as I've said, I was explaining about REST and SOAP. If you see in the REST API, and when we see the demo, I will explain you this furthermore, but when you see and explore the REST API, the resource as well as the action is basically wrapped in a URL itself. So that's basically wrapped in a request part itself. So you don't have to basically specify the resource as well as its method under the request parameter, but it's basically available under the URL. And then it basically throws a response which you get again in a JSON object. So it gives you a REST-like experience. The endpoints which you have the VI JSON coverage is basically the vSphere Web Service API, and anything that is under vSphere or Virtual Infrastructure Management API. So you had the SOAP API for virtual infrastructure management. We have the VI JSON coverage for that as well. We had the SOAP API for ESX Agent Manager, so we have the VI JSON coverage for that as well. A storage lifecycle, a storage monitoring service, storage policy. Almost all the SOAP APIs that were bundled under vSphere Web Service API do have the VI JSON coverage. The only remaining piece that we have to deliver on the VI JSON is the coverage for vSAN, and that is something which we have scheduled for VCF 9.0. So once we release VCF 9.0, we will have the VI JSON coverage for vSAN as well. Now, what is the advantage, and what are the things that attract you as the consumer of VI JSON API? The first thing is REST-like experience. As I've said, SOAP is a little bit complex. It is a little bit old. If you have a new developer in your team, most probably he would not understand SOAP API, and he would have to take some reading to get understood with the SOAP API. So it does provide a REST-like experience, which gives you a quick onboarding, a quick spin up time to get started with these API. The another important piece is the OpenAPI v3 conformance. From our side, what we want is, we want to have all our APIs to be conformant on the OpenAPI v3 specification. be it vSAN, be it vSphere, be it NSX or any other product, it should have the OpenAPI v3 standard. Why it is important? OpenAPI v3 is basically an API specification document. It's basically a schema that define and explain what this API is all about. So for example, if you are a developer and if you want to understand all and everything about that particular API, you basically look for an API schema. This API schema, which is OpenAPI v3, is human readable and it is also a machine readable. So it has the construct, it has a structure that you can read and you can basically pass it to any other tool. And that particular tool will generate the automatic client binding, which we call it as SDK. It can generate the documents and it can also do the API validation on its own. So we have an open source tool which we refer it as OpenAPI generator, which can generate the client binding. If you remember when I was talking about the SDK stuff, we are committed to deliver Python and Java SDKs for our APIs. But what about .NET? What about TypeScript? From our side, it would be difficult to build the API bindings for each and every language. So what we now intend to do is we would provide you the OpenAPI v3 document. You will throw this particular document to, let's say, OpenAPI generator. And then there is another tool which Microsoft has released, which is Kyoto. You can throw these specification document to these tools, and it will automatically generate the SDK bindings for you. So now what we have is we have the specification document that you can take. It is publicly available, and then you can generate your own language binding. It is important because most of our customers, if we look at, they use different language in their environment. Some use .NET, some use TypeScript, some use JavaScript, some of it using Java or let's say Python, right? So if you look at our customer base, they use different language bindings, and it is very important for us to provide this API specification document so that they can take this document and generate the automatic client bindings for their preferred language. And that gives the extensibility to build their own web services on top of VMware APIs. And then the intention is to basically support the interoperability and backward compatibility, so that it can work with vSphere Automation API and also with the SOAP APIs. The OpenAPI v3, what it looks like. So this is a structure. It has an info, which basically tells about the API specification document and its version, what is the title. It has the server endpoint and then some of the security features that it has. So for example, what are the server endpoint you will be invoking these APIs against? And then these are the paths. These are basically the API paths that you have. It has a tag, it has reference external documentation, and then all the components that that a specific API is using. Now, over here, what you are seeing is a simple OpenAPI reference documentation. So for example, this is the info, this is the version, this is the server endpoint where this API would hit, and this is the API or VMware versioning. And these are the actual API paths. So the path is basically the server URL and then /alarm /manage object and then reconfigure alarm. Then it has a method, which is post, which is you are trying to invoke a post method. And then these are tags and how the response and request is structured. Now, this particular API document is consistent across all the providers. If you go to AWS, if you go to Google, if you go to Azure, all of their APIs have the OpenAPI spec. You take this OpenAPI spec, you send this OpenAPI spec as the input to, let's say, OpenAPI generator or Kyoto. It will generate the automatic client-side binding for you on your own. So now what we have is we have the OpenAPI specification document, which you can reuse and you can build your client-side bindings with your preferred language. So that's very important aspect for us to deliver on. So right now, we have the OpenAPI spec for almost all these solutions. The only solution which we don't have is probably vSAN and then some part of vSphere, which we intend to deliver in the future version of VCF. Let's quickly talk about the single session authentication. So as I've said, we have different API endpoints. For example, vSphere Web Service API, we have SOAP, we have VI JSON, we have REST, and then we have SOAP for vSAN. what does single session authentication means? Let's say if you authenticate through a SOAP API endpoint, you can reuse that particular authentication to any of these API endpoints that you are seeing over here. It gives you a very simplified, very unified experience of working with APIs. So for example, in this particular case, we have we are creating a session from vSphere automation APIs, which is a REST API. So anything that you see /API is basically the vSphere automation API, which are written in REST. Once you run this command, you get the API session ID, and then you reuse the same session in a SOAP API. So the next command that you see is basically a SOAP API, which has a different URL compared to what you have seen over here, but it can now reuse the session initiated from the automation API. You can do a reverse. You can have a session initiated from vSphere Web Service API, and then you can reuse the session in the vSphere automation API or even vSAN SOAP API. So that's about all the deliverables that we have delivered. And let me quickly jump into the demo and let me see if there are any questions before we hit into the demo.
No questions yet. But Jatin, this reminds me of so I remember in Explore that there was a speaker that would come on, and this guy was like extremely knowledgeable, right? He was just extremely knowledgeable, and I would sit there, and I was used to having my laptop with me and like taking my notes or like a notebook or something and writing things down. But then sometimes I was like, oh man, I just need to sit back and just watch and like don't do anything because I'm gonna miss something. And then I'm gonna go back and watch a replay later because there's just a lot coming at you. It's but no, this is great. Thank you.
Basically, you are saying that we are delivering complex topics.
Yeah, no, and that's perfect, right? And how you mentioned Power CLI earlier, I love Power CLI. It's the most readable thing to me. So I'm definitely one of those. I probably downloaded it like 100 times myself. So yeah, for that 59 million. So no, great work. Thank you.
Perfect. So let's get start with some of the demos. We have 10 minutes. We can extend to, let's say, 2 or 3 minutes more, but I will quickly wrap some of these demos in 10, 15 minutes. But yeah, it will be really quick and it will be really helpful. So where to look at the API reference documentation? So the first place is go to developer.broadcom.com. Earlier, it used to be developer.vmware.com. But either way, if you hit developer.vmware.com, it would redirect you to developer.broadcom.com. That's where all our API, SDK, and Power CLI documentation, its code samples are available. So come here. This is the API section. And trust me, we have found some of the issues in this particular documentation. So if you are encountering some of the issues, let's say related to examples, or it could be as simple as not finding the relevant information, we are aware of it, and we are currently working to fix those issues as well going forward. But for core infrastructure, which is vSphere, vSAN, all these pieces, you should come to hyperconverged, or you can simply search the respective API and you will find the API documentation. So let's talk about this documentation, which is vSphere Web Service API. If you are old enough to start your career with, let's say, vSphere 5 or vSphere 6 era, or maybe before that, this would sound like a similar or familiar API documentation experience. So this is our SOAP API that you have. Let me go back and just open another API documentation, and that's the REST API documentation. So now the API documentation that you see, which is vSphere Automation API, this is a REST API documentation. Let me again go back and open up another API documentation, which is the new one, which is the VI JSON. Why I'm opening all these documentation all at once? Because I want to give you a sense of how these APIs look and function with respect to each other. So let's take a look at the Web Service API. The Web Service APIs were built around manage object. You can call it as resource, or you can call it as manage object. What are the manage objects we have? If you click, we have plenty of it, right? I don't remember the count, but you have alarms, you have virtual machine, you have ESXi, you have cluster, pretty much everything that you see and
Thousand,
experience in VCF. Yeah.
thousand and something are the managed objects.
Thank you, Angel. So yeah, the bottom line is we have huge amount of managed objects, and now if you think of the reach that we have on SOAP APIs is quite vast. You are basically dealing with a huge set of APIs which are actually written in SOAP and XML. Let's take one example, which is the virtual machine. So let's quickly come here. If you come down, you will see a manage object virtual machine, right? This document, this is how a SOAP API document looks like. And trust me, Frankie, if you know, just send this document to, let's say, a new developer who is recently graduate, he will be having a hard time to understand it. Okay, it's no secret, but yeah, these are important APIs. These are important. They deliver important functions. So it is very important for us to have these APIs. But this is how the SOAP API document looks like. I was talking about the API and what are the parameters and what are the methods it has. So the properties are basically defining the characteristic of that particular resource. So it has a layout, which is basically the file layout, the guest operating system, the network information, the name, everything is basically a property. And if you see, each property is itself is a managed object resource. So what you have is you basically have nested resources which are calling each other wherever they are referenced at. But the most important part is the method, because if you explore any API, you are actually trying to execute some task, right? And these tasks are basically categorized as methods. So, for example, if you can follow my mouse, the simple relatable task can be power off a virtual machine or power on a virtual machine, right? Which is good. I could figure out, let's say, if I have to basically power on a virtual machine, and if I want to find an API for it, I can go to the virtual machine object. So for that, you have to figure out what is the resource that you have to basically work on. So in this particular case, it is virtual machine, and then go into the method, which is power on and power off. Now, this is a method, and this is how the documentation looks like. But now here is the challenge. I don't see an example of using this particular method, right? This is a typical SOAP API. It has the API definition, it has the parameters, it has different fault responses that you can understand. But if I'm a new developer who hasn't experienced a SOAP API, how do I understand how to execute these APIs, right? So it is very difficult, it is complex. So let me go back and log in into my environment, lab environment, and show you how to execute the SOAP APIs. Okay, so I'm into the VS Code. We will be using an API client, which is known as Postman. The current client that I'm using is basically a VS Code plugin, but you can download Postman separately and then run Postman, or you can use curl command to basically execute these APIs. So let's look at the first API. Okay, this is the API URL, the API server, and that's the API endpoint, right? And why I'm highlighting it, because it's very important to understand some of these parameters. And then this is the method. All the SOAP APIs have a single method, which is post. That's the body. Don't remember my password. I will change it after this session, so nothing to worry about. But this is how you basically prepare an SOAP API. You have a SOAP envelope, which has a schema defined in WSDL. So this particular URL is basically defining the WSDL API specification. It has a response body which contains the API message. That's the resource you are currently working in, which is the session manager. That's the parameter, which is name, username, and password. And then it's again wrapping up all these messages. So this is how you actually execute a SOAP API. Let me hit send. I hope it works. It worked. It has given me the login time, the last active time, and that's it. So I now have a session which is established with the SOAP API. But here is the important thing. I'm
Jatin,
sending a request. Yep.
Are you able to zoom in a little bit?
Okay. Just give me.
Does it let you? Sorry.
Just give me a minute.
Gracias.
I think it should be good. No?
It's a little bit better. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, but the larger picture is you have the XML request and then you have the XML response. And that's how you basically work with SOAP API. So now I have environment. Let me quickly log in. I think this would be visible, right, Frankie?
Oh yeah, yeah. This is beautiful.
So again, what I'm doing is basically I'm logging into the environment through Power CLI so that I can quickly show you the virtual machine state and things of those lines. But meanwhile, it gets logged in. Let me quickly go to the web browser and show you the environment, and then we'll be operating some of the operations here. So this is my vCenter server environment, and I have a virtual machine, which is a test VM. If you see, this is currently powered on. Let's power up this virtual machine through a SOAP API. So again, I come back, get VM, test VM. It says it's powered on. And the one thing which we need to work with SOAP API is basically the manage object ID, right? Which we call it as MOID or mob ID. So get VM, get the view. The get view is basically the SOAP explorer for Power CLI, right? If you are working with vCenter / MOB, right? If you go to /MOB, that's a web-based SOAP explorer. But for Power CLI, the SOAP API binding is basically the get view. Under this, you have a manage object reference ID, which is 17996, right? So now let's power off a virtual machine, which is currently powered on. And let's see how the SOAP API works. And then we'll do the same thing with the VI JSON API. So currently this virtual machine is powered on. Let me power off the virtual machine through a SOAP API. So this is my API. If you look at the difference, if I go to the login, check the URL. It's the same URL, again, same URL. And that's where the SOAP APIs are, right? You have a same URL for the API endpoint, and everything that you do with the API endpoint, you do it with the XML message body, right? You send your message through an XML data. That's how you do it. That's the SOAP API for you. So this is the resource. This is the resource, which is the virtual machine, and then this is the task that you want to perform on this particular virtual machine. Let me quickly check the session cookie, and we will send this particular API and power of the virtual machine. So I come under the authorization API key, or let's say let's do the inherit. So now it has initiated a task. The authorization that I have set is basically inherit authentication from parent, because I have already logged in with the SOAP API. What it has done, it has basically initiated a task to power off the virtual machine. So let's go back to the VMware environment. You see a task which is created to power up the virtual machine, and that's how you work with the SOAP API, right? So let's see the power off status, and you will see that now it is currently powered off. So the important thing to remember over here is, if you are working with the SOAP API, your API URL doesn't give you much information. For that, you basically have to understand and pass your XML data for the request and for also the response. Now let's take a look at the same example for the VI JSON. For the VI JSON in the body, we don't have much of the things. Let me quickly come here. So this is the VI JSON API. This is my API endpoint. This is the resource I'm working on. This is the manage object ID of that particular resource, and that's the action that I'm performing. This is more like a REST API experience compared to SOAP, and I'm hitting a post method on this. Let me hit this particular API, and then it's okay. No authentication. Let me quickly fix the authorization cookies. This is my new authentication key. Power of the VM. API session ID is this. Let's send, and then it has initiated task, right? Now, if you compare this particular example, which is giving you an output in JSON, and now if you compare an example compared to this, right, this is giving you an output with XML. So with VI.JSON, what we have done is we have given you a very simple way of executing your API with JSON RPC so that you can send your request and response through a JSON object and not through an XML. And also, if you see the API definition and the URL, the resource and the action are actually encapsulated in the URL endpoint itself. And if you compare this to SOAP, everything that you do with SOAP, it has to be encoded in the XML envelope, and that's very different experience compared to the rest. Now, if I see this particular API, and then this is a true, REST API, right? This is a REST API, which is covered in vSphere Automation API. What you have is you have similar kind of a pattern where you have the resource, its action, everything is encapsulated in the URL. So you have a web service experience, which is the SOAP API, which encodes everything in the XML document. Then you have VI.JSON, which elevates that experience and then gives you the REST API like experience. So that's the VI.JSON for you. The documentation for VI.JSON is available on developer.broadcom.com. So you can come here and then you can see the documentation. It's essentially the same API, but has a REST-like experience for running these API. So that's one demo that I wanted to present. I have one last demo, and let's do a quick one because we are running out of time on the unified authentication. So if I come here, what I have is basically I have imported the automation API SDK, which is the REST API, and then I have a pyvmomi, which is the SOAP API. So what I'm doing is I'm basically taking the inputs to create a session in REST API. So this is a function to create a session in REST API. I will get the REST API session ID, and then I will pass this particular session ID in the SOAP API. So the smart connect function that you see is basically a function for the SOAP API. So let's quickly go there, run this particular example, and see the unified authentication in action. So I have unified authentication 1.py. So it has created a session in REST API, and then it is validating whether this particular session is true for SOAP API or not. So that's how this particular session has been transferred. Another example, same. Now this time I'm doing a reverse. I will be taking a session from SOAP and then passing this to a REST API. I have a session ID, and then it has, so this session ID you received, this is basically from SOAP API, and the output that you see is basically an API which is invoking a REST API. So let me go back to the code, and if you see the function, this is what we are doing. We are logging in with pyvmomi. We are getting the session ID with pyvmomi, which is a SOAP API SDK for Python, and then we are reusing this particular session in the REST API. So similarly, you can do the same thing for vSAN or other solutions down the line. So that's about it. These are a few enhancements that we have delivered. I have written a blog post, and then we can share that blog post to community as well. But yeah, I know it was plenty of stuff to fit into an hour-long session. But yeah, I hope this one was useful, and you can now go there and check the VI.JSON documentation for your own, and then get back to us if you have any feedback. So Frankie, that's about it. That's from my side. And Engel, anything that you want to highlight?
If I have 1-2 minutes just to wrap up at the end, what we are trying to achieve with few words on all these areas on API and SDK. On the API area, our North Star, I would call it, is at the end to have a unified standard across all the VCF endpoints. And this, it was already presented by Jatin, is OpenAPI 3.0. Why we decided this one? Because we want to make a smooth transition for our customers. We are not we are not imagining how we are going to rewrite all the SOAP APIs in the new REST APIs, and all our customers will have to rewrite their code, their solutions. It will be painful for them and for us as well. So that's why we are introducing a new VI JSON for SOAP APIs, which is a REST-like protocol, and we are going to produce an open API schema across the whole VCF APIs. This is on one hand. We want to improve the usability by having a unified authentication across all these endpoints. We started with the vSphere, but we are going to expand with the rest of the VCF components. And on the SDK area, our North Star is to have a single Python SDK and single Java SDK with all the components of VCF, even for those that are missing and they don't have SDKs. This will bring consistency in terms of what kind of programming languages we are supporting and we are providing to our customers. But on top, like Jatin said, and we are trying to make this as a story, the Open API will be the going forward for customers that are not used to Java, to Python. We have some examples with customers that are experienced in JavaScript, in TypeScript, so they can build their own bindings out of the Open API, and then they can automate their infrastructure using those bindings. So in essence, this we are going to provide to our customers, or like I call it at the beginning, we are going to provide a experience the same like the public clouds. This is but available on your private cloud. Yeah, that's it from my side.
Excellent. How can people? What is the best way for people to reach out to you? Just in case they do have questions.
Directly, I can share my working email so they can contact me. With many customers, I have meetings, a lot of roadmap presentations, and usually this is the way they're connecting me, and we organize the next steps.
And then for me, I'm sharing my link tree, which has LinkedIn, Twitter, all my social media presence. You can share it with the community, and then we can take it up from there.
Perfect.
Yeah, I can share my link as well. Yeah.
Thank you, and also too, there. I just want to shout out over at Explore Las Vegas. Yeah, unfortunately, Angel couldn't be there, but we do have Jatin and Sandeep, right?
Yes.
Yes. So yeah, we have that session going on, and I will put a link to that session as well. So yeah, so definitely come by, swing by, and ask your questions that directly to the experts while you have them there, right? Take advantage of it. And when I was a customer, when I was a VMware customer, that was my favorite part. Like the very first time I went to Explore, I signed. I kind of made the mistake of just filling up my entire schedule with sessions everywhere. And but I honest to goodness, I got so much out of it. And then like the second time around, like you kind of get better at it. And I took all my questions, all the issues that I had, my questions, right? Just questions of my entire environment that had to do with VMware. I took them, and I knew like there was the Meet the Experts table, there were the round tables, there's all the sessions, and then the best part to me was listening to a session, right, where maybe during the session everybody was completely quiet because there's a lot coming at you, but afterwards, afterwards, all the customers line up, and like, oh man, I would sit down in the front row and listen to all the customers and like asking their questions. It is extremely valuable, and yeah, I would knock out my questions like, oh, that's the answer to this one. Oh, I didn't think of that one. And I think those are the best parts to go into explore and taking advantage of this. So again, thank you both. Hopefully, Angel, I think we've spoken over email too with both of you. We've come up with different ideas of different power sessions or for the code community. So so let's keep that ball going too. I want to be able to get more sessions like this. But thanks again, and thank you very much for sharing your contact email here. Definitely send Angel all your questions, and also Jatin, don't be shy. They're super nice people. Well, thanks again, and let's get back to work. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Frankie.
Thank you.
Bye. Take care.